Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're taking a closer look at how climate variability shook things up for renewable energy resources and demand back in 2023.
Yeah, a lot going on that year.
For sure.
Should be interesting.
To make this a little easier to digest, we're going to mainly focus on the big three: wind power,
Of course.
solar power,
Uh-huh.
and hydropower.
Makes sense.
And we'll be using the capacity factor metric as a yardstick.
Right. Capacity factor basically tells us how much juice these sources actually squeezed out compared to what they could have produced at full throttle.
Exactly. And this gets really fascinating when you consider 2023 had that unusual flip from La Niña to El Niño.
Oh, yeah. That really threw a wrench into global weather patterns and created some pretty wild regional differences in how well renewable energy sources performed.
For sure. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today and hopefully unlock some insights for better energy planning down the road.
Definitely a lot to learn from 2023.
Absolutely. So before we dive into the specifics, let's set the global stage a bit.
Okay, sounds good.
First off, 2023 is the hottest year on record at the time.
Yeah, it was a scorcher.
And there was this huge global push to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030.
A very ambitious goal,
Big goals.
especially with global electricity demand steadily climbing.
Right, so the pressure was on.
Oh, for sure. And amidst all this wind and solar power, we're growing like crazy, with solar actually overtaking hydropower in terms of how much capacity was installed globally.
Wow, so a real turning point for solar.
Yeah, it was a big year.
Definitely. Now let's zoom in on how each of these sources actually performed, starting with wind power.
Okay.
Globally, the wind capacity factor in 2023 was, it was a bit of a roller coaster ride thanks to that La Niña to El Niño switch.
Yeah, it was all over the place. Some areas saw big winds, others not so much.
Right, like Eastern Asia.
Oh, yeah, they hit the jackpot, especially China. Their wind capacity factor jumped somewhere between 4 and 8%.
Not bad.
Not bad at all. And when you consider the massive scale of China's wind power installations, huge. That seemingly small percentage translates to an insane amount of energy. We're talking enough extra power to give every person in China roughly 130 watt hours every single day.
That's a lot of extra juice.
It is a game changer for sure.
So it's a big win for Eastern Asia.
Yeah.
But I imagine there were also some regions that didn't fare so well.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the nature of the game when it comes to climate variability and renewable energy.
Right. Someone wins, someone loses.
Exactly. And one of the biggest losers in the wind power department was India.
Oh, really?
Yeah, their wind capacity factor took a hit in the same 4 to 8% range. But on the flip side,
Which meant a significant energy loss.
oh yeah, we're talking about 7 terawatt hours down the drain, a real blow to their energy supply.
Ouch. That really underscores how risky it is to rely too heavily on a single energy source, especially one as fickle as wind power.
Yeah, it's a vulnerability that a lot of countries are grappling with, especially as climate change keeps throwing curveballs our way.
It makes you wonder if there's a way to create a more interconnected system where regions with a surplus of wind power could lend a hand to those facing a deficit.
It's definitely an idea worth exploring, a kind of energy safety net where countries can support each other during those climate-driven ups and downs.
Right, exactly, because ultimately we're all in this together.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, now let's shift gears and talk about solar power. Did it experience the same level of volatility as wind power in 2023?
Actually, no. While solar power is definitely still at the mercy of climate variability, the global capacity factor anomalies were generally smaller than what we saw with wind power, pretty much stayed within a 10% range.
So a bit more stable overall.
Yeah, relatively speaking, but there were still some interesting regional differences.
Oh, I bet, where did solar really shine in 2023?
South America had some good fortune, particularly Brazil. Their solar capacity factor got a nice little bump somewhere between 4 and 6%.
Not too shabby.
Not at all. That translates to an extra 3 terawatt hours of energy annually, which is enough to give every Brazilian an extra 37 watt hours per day.
Hey, every little bit counts, right?
Absolutely. But of course, not every region was basking in the solar bounty.
Right. There have to be some downsides, too.
Yeah, like Eastern Africa, they actually saw a dip in their solar capacity factor, mainly because of increased cloud cover, likely due to those El Niño shenanigans.
Ah, El Niño strikes again, always keeping things interesting.
Always.
All right, so we've covered wind and solar now. Let's tackle the last member of our renewable energy trio, hydropower.
Okay.
Now, I know this one's a bit tricky because we're using a proxy indicator based on precipitation and how much hydropower capacity is installed in a given area.
Right. It's not a perfect measurement, but it gives us a decent idea of how much potential energy is locked up in those water resources.
Right, and unfortunately the picture wasn't all that rosy for hydropower in 2023.
No, not really. We saw some pretty significant decreases in our hydropower proxy across several regions: South America, North America, China, Russia, South Asia, Australia, you name it. They were all feeling the pinch.
Wow, that's a lot of hydropower hotspots facing a drought, so to speak.
Yeah, and these decreases were mainly driven by reduced rainfall, which is a big problem for countries that rely heavily on hydropower for their electricity.
I can imagine, like, how bad are we talking here?
Well, take Sudan, for example. They saw a rainfall reduction of over 50%, which is a huge deal considering hydropower provides about 70% of their electricity.
Wow, that's a major energy crisis waiting to happen.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of how vulnerable we can be when our energy supply is tied to a single source, especially one as sensitive to climate fluctuations as hydropower.
Absolute diversification is key.
Couldn't agree more, and while some regions did see positive variations in the hydropower proxy, the overall trend definitely raises some red flags about how we can create a more resilient energy system in the face of a changing climate.
Right, because it's not just about having enough energy. It's about having a reliable and sustainable supply no matter what Mother Nature throws our way.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered wind, solar, hydropower, but there's another crucial piece of this energy puzzle that we haven't talked about yet: demand.
Oh yeah, demand the other side of the equation.
Exactly, and to get a handle on that, we're using a nifty little proxy called energy degree days, or EDDs for short.
EDDs basically combine heating and cooling needs based on temperature, so it gives us a good sense of how much energy we need to stay comfortable.
Makes sense. So what did the EDDs tell us about energy demand in 2023?
Well, it was quite a mixed bag. Some regions got a bit of an energy break while others saw demand skyrocket.
Oh, that sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
So a lot of regions, especially in the northern hemisphere, saw their EDDs drop significantly, mainly because of those milder winters we talked about earlier.
Oh, right. Less heating, needed less energy demanded.
Exactly. Canada, for example, saw about 50 fewer EDDs compared to their 30-year average.
Wow, so those milder winters really did provide some relief on the energy front.
They did, but of course there's always a flip side.
Oh, I bet. Like, what about regions that got hit with hotter temperatures?
Yeah, places like sub-Saharan Africa and Central America, they saw their EDDs climb because of increased cooling needs, all those air conditioners working overtime.
Makes sense. You crank up the AC, you crank up the energy demand. It's a simple equation.
It is, and it all boils down to this intricate dance between renewable energy resources and demand, both being pushed and pulled by the whims of climate variability.
Yeah, and it seems like the steps to this dance are changing as our climate evolves.
Oh, absolutely. That's why understanding these complex relationships is so crucial for building a more resilient and sustainable energy future.
For sure. Well said. Now that we've set the global stage, I think it's time to zoom in and explore how this energy dance played out in different regions of the world.
Sounds good. I'm ready to get granular.
Awesome. So let's kick off our regional deep dives with a trip to Southern Africa, where we'll focus on a group of neighboring countries: Mozambique, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia.
A region that's really leading the way in terms of energy collaboration.
Very cool. I can't wait to see what insights we uncover.
Me neither. Should be fascinating. So Southern Africa, a region that's really at the forefront of energy cooperation. These four countries: Mozambique, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia. They've actually joined forces to create something called the Southern African Power Pool.
The Southern African Power Pool, what's that all about?
It's basically a way for these nations to create a more interconnected energy system, allowing them to share resources across borders, kind of like an energy safety net, you know?
Well, that's really interesting, so they can help each other out when times get tough.
Exactly. It's all about regional collaboration and making sure everyone has access to a reliable energy supply.
I like a strength in numbers, right?
Absolutely. So let's see how this power pool dynamic played out in 2023. Remember, we're looking at those monthly variations to really understand how climate variability impacted their energy resources.
Right. The ups and downs, the ebb and flow of it all.
Exactly. And one thing that jumps out right away is how different the climate conditions can be even between neighboring countries.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like in January 2023, Zambia got hit with a major solar slump. Their solar capacity factor was way lower than any of the 30 reference years.
Wow, that's rough.
It was. But here's the interesting part. During that same period, Mozambique and Tanzania actually saw slightly positive solar capacity factors.
So while one country was struggling with a solar deficit, their neighbors had a surplus. That's where that power pool comes in handy, right?
Bingo, it shows how important it is to have these flexible energy systems and strong regional partnerships because if one country has a surplus, they can export energy to their neighbor who's facing a shortage.
Like a real-life energy exchange program.
Exactly, and that kind of coordinated response can really help cushion the blow of those climate-driven energy swings.
Makes a lot of sense now what happened as the year went on and El Niño started to flex its muscles.
Well, as El Niño gained strength towards the end of the year, we saw even more shifts in energy resources and demand. Let's take Tanzania, for example.
Right.
In November and December, their wind capacity factors were a bit lower than usual.
Not ideal.
No, but their hydropower indicator was actually above average, probably due to increased rainfall during El Niño.
So hydropower stepped up to fill the gap left by wind. That's the beauty of a diversified energy mix.
It is, and with Tanzania's significant hydropower potential, they could potentially even help out their neighbors who might be facing wind and solar deficits.
Turning that challenge into an opportunity.
Exactly. It's all about thinking regionally and working together to create a more stable and resilient energy system.
So Tanzania was doing okay, but what about Malawi and Zambia? How did they fare during those last few months of 2023?
Well, both countries saw their energy demand increase in November and December.
Not surprising with the holidays and all.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Malawi had a positive hydropower indicator in November, but then in December, both Malawi and Zambia saw pretty big reductions in their hydropower potential.
Oh, so a double whammy,
Yeah.
just when they needed it most.
Yeah, it really highlights the vulnerability of relying too heavily on hydropower, especially in a region that's prone to these climate fluctuations.
Right, so what happened? Did they have to resort to rolling blackouts or something?
Well, that's where the Southern African power pool really proved its worth. Remember, Zambia had higher than normal solar capacity factors in both November and December, and Malawi's solar situation also improved in December.
So solar power was able to step in and save the day, at least partially?
To some extent, yes, it shows how important it is to have a mix of energy sources that can complement each other during these critical times.
It's like having a diversified energy portfolio spreading the risk, so to speak.
Exactly, and Southern Africa is a great example of how that kind of approach can pay off in the long run.
It's really inspiring to see how they're tackling these complex energy challenges head on and working together to create a more sustainable future.
It's a model for other regions to follow.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Okay, let's switch gears now and journey over to the Middle East. We're going to focus on 4 countries in this region: the UAE, Qatar, Oman, and Yemen.
Our region facing a whole different set of energy challenges.
Right, very different climate, very different energy demand.
Exactly. They have incredibly high energy demands fueled by rapid economic growth and those scorching desert temperatures.
And let's not forget the whole geopolitical landscape.
Oh, yeah, there's that too. It's a complex region for sure.
So how do those factors play into their renewable energy situation?
Well, the big challenge for them is that their renewable resources can be pretty unpredictable. It's a constant balancing act trying to meet those high energy demands with a fluctuating supply.
Makes sense. So what kind of trends did you observe in this region?
Well, one of the most striking things was the huge swing in energy demand that happened in January 2023. All 4 countries, except for Oman, saw massive shifts in their energy degree days compared to the reference period.
Wow, that's a big deal. What caused such a dramatic change?
It seems like those higher than average temperatures led to a big drop in heating needs, which in turn lowered those energy degree days. Remember, EDDs represent the combined heating and cooling needs.
Right, so it's warmer than usual. You don't need as much heat, which means less energy demand.
Exactly. And in this case, it seems like that warm spell actually gave them a bit of an energy break.
Interesting. So sometimes those unusual weather patterns can work in your favor.
Sometimes, but it also highlights the importance of having accurate temperature predictions so you can anticipate those demand shifts and plan accordingly.
Right, because if you're caught off guard, it could lead to either an energy surplus or a shortage, neither of which is ideal.
For sure, it's all about being prepared.
Okay, so they dodged a bullet in January, but what about later in the year when energy demands typically start to climb again?
Well, unfortunately for the Middle East, their wind and solar indicators were mostly negative in November and December.
Not good high demand, low renewable energy production. That's a recipe for trouble.
It is, but there is a glimmer of hope. The UAE recently built this massive pumped storage hydroelectric plant called the Hatta plant, and it seems like it really helped them out during that period.
Pumped storage hydro. That sounds
Wow.
interesting. What is that exactly?
It's a really clever way to store energy. Using water, basically, they pump water uphill to a reservoir when energy demand is low, and then when demand spikes, they release that water downhill through turbines to generate electricity.
So it's like a giant battery for hydropower that's brilliant.
It's a great example of how technology can help overcome the limitations of natural resources.
Very cool. So the UAE is taking a proactive approach to diversifying their energy mix and bolstering their energy security.
They are, but it's important to remember that relying solely on data from those proxy indicators might not tell the whole story.
What do you mean?
Well, we need data on actual energy generation from those renewable sources to really understand how they're contributing to the overall energy mix. Those proxy indicators are helpful, but they can sometimes mask the true picture.
That's a good point. It's a reminder that data is only as good as its interpretation.
Exactly. We always need to be digging deeper and looking at the bigger picture.
All right, let's wrap up our regional deep dives with a trip to South America, a continent that's both blessed with abundant renewable energy resources and highly susceptible to El Niño's influence.
It's a land of extremes for sure. We'll focus on 4 countries, Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Brazil, each with their own unique energy story to tell.
Sounds good. Let's start with Brazil. They were right in the thick of it with El Niño in November and December, weren't they?
Yeah, they were facing the classic El Niño scenario, increased energy demand due to those hot summer temperatures. But fortunately, their solar capacity factor was above average, especially in November.
So solar came to the rescue.
To some extent, yes. And their wind capacity factor also saw a little bump. But hydropower, which is their primary source of electricity, took a bit of a hit. The proxy indicator dropped by something like 30 to 40%.
Ouch. So even with those solar and wind gains, they still felt the pinch of reduced hydropower.
They did. It just goes to show how important it is to have that diversified energy mix, because even if one source falters, the others can help pick up the slack.
Right, like having a backup generator for your energy system.
Exactly. It's all about building resilience and adaptability into your energy strategy.
Makes sense. Now, what about Colombia? How did they handle the El Niño heat?
Well, they seemed to manage those November demand spikes pretty well. They had increased solar power generation, which helped offset those slight reductions in hydropower. And then in December, even though their solar capacity factor dipped a bit, hydropower bounced back to near average levels.
So they rode the solar wave for as long as they could and then seamlessly transitioned back to hydropower. Nice.
Yeah, it seems like their energy system weathered the storm fairly well.
That's great to hear. What about Chile? Did they face any unique challenges?
Chile had a very different experience. Their energy demand in November went through the roof, almost 40% above normal.
Wow, that's a big jump.
It was, but they had a secret weapon. Their hydropower proxy increased dramatically, and their wind capacity factor also went up.
So a double dose of renewable energy goodness.
Exactly. And those combined forces more than compensated for a small dip in their solar capacity factor.
It's amazing how different energy sources can step up at different times to meet those fluctuating demands. It's like a perfectly choreographed dance.
It is, and it highlights the importance of understanding those regional nuances and tailoring your energy strategies accordingly.
Right, because there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to energy.
Absolutely. Okay, last but not least, let's check in with Peru. They had a very interesting trend. Their energy demand was actually lower than normal in November and December.
Oh, that's unusual. What happened there?
It's hard to say for sure, but it seems like they ended up with an energy surplus, which was further boosted by a 10% increase in their hydropower proxy.
So while other countries were facing deficits, Peru had an abundance of hydropower. Did they share any of that extra energy with their neighbors?
That's a great question, and one that energy policymakers definitely need to consider. But Peru's situation also raises another important point. While their reliance on hydropower worked out well in this instance, it also makes them vulnerable to future climate shifts.
Right, it's a double-edged sword.
It is, and it reinforces the need for diversification, even when you have a seemingly abundant renewable resource.
It's all about balancing those short-term gains with long-term sustainability.
Exactly. And that's the key takeaway from all of these regional deep dives. A truly resilient energy future requires diversification, regional collaboration, and a deep understanding of how climate variability impacts both our energy resources and our energy demands.
Well said. It's a complex challenge, but it's also an incredibly exciting time to be working on these issues because we're literally shaping the future of energy.
I couldn't agree more. It's all about innovation, collaboration, and a commitment to creating a cleaner and more sustainable world.
Okay, so we've seen how climate variability can really throw a wrench into the energy system. But what if we had a crystal ball a way to get a sneak peek at what's coming down the pike.
Well, we might not have a crystal ball, but we do have something pretty close: seasonal climate forecasts.
Seasonal climate forecasts, those sound promising. What are those all about?
Basically, they give us a heads up about future climate conditions like temperature, precipitation, wind speeds, solar radiation, all that good stuff.
So instead of just reacting to those climate-driven energy shifts, we can actually anticipate them and plan accordingly.
Exactly. It's all about moving from a reactive to a proactive approach to energy management.
I like that being one step ahead of the game.
Exactly. And these forecasts can help us do just that.
Okay, so how do these forecasts work? Are we talking about predicting the next El Niño or La Niña years in advance?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. These forecasts provide probabilistic information about different climate variables over a period of several months to a season.
So it's not about pinpoint accuracy, but rather a range of possibilities.
Right. Think of it like a weather forecast, but instead of predicting the weather for a specific day, we're looking at broader trends over a longer period.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But how reliable are these forecasts? Can we really base important energy planning decisions on them?
Well, the accuracy of these forecasts can vary depending on a few factors: the specific variable, the region, the lead time. Some variables like temperature are generally more predictable than others, like wind speed.
So the further out we look, the more uncertain those predictions become.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even with those limitations, these forecasts can still provide valuable information that can significantly improve energy planning.
Okay, I'm starting to see the potential here. Can we look at a real-world example to see how this plays out?
Absolutely. Let's go back to South America and focus on November 2023. We can compare the seasonal forecasts for wind speed, solar radiation, precipitation, and temperature with what actually happened.
Perfect, a real-life test case.
Exactly. So let's start with wind speed. The seasonal forecast issued back on October 1st indicated a higher probability of stronger than normal winds for most of South America.
And was it accurate?
It was the observed wind speeds in November 2023 were indeed higher than average across most of the continent.
So the forecast nailed it on wind speed. What about solar radiation?
Well, that one was a bit of a mixed bag. The forecast indicated a strong signal for higher than average solar radiation over much of Brazil, but lower than average radiation for Peru, southern Brazil, and Uruguay.
So some areas had more sun, others got less.
Right, and again, the observations largely aligned with the forecast.
Wow, 2 for 2 so far. These forecasts are looking pretty good. What about precipitation? That's obviously crucial for hydropower generation.
The forecast predicted drier conditions for most of South America, with higher precipitation only in Peru, southern Brazil, and Uruguay.
And did that hold true?
For the most part, yes, the observations generally matched the forecast.
Okay, last but not least, temperature. What did the forecast predict?
The forecast showed a strong likelihood of above-average temperatures across most of South America, with cooler conditions only in the southern part of the continent.
Yeah, how did that compare to reality?
Pretty much spot on. November 2023 was warmer than average for most of the region, just as the forecast predicted.
So it seems like those seasonal forecasts were quite accurate for South America in November 2023. That's pretty impressive.
It is. It really highlights the value of these forecasts for energy planning. Imagine being able to anticipate those shifts in wind and solar resources, or those energy demand spikes due to hotter temperatures.
It's like having a secret weapon in the energy game.
In a way, yes. And while these forecasts aren't perfect, they offer valuable insights that can help us make more informed decisions about our energy future.
And the more we use them, the better we understand their strengths and limitations.
Exactly. It's a learning process.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. We've explored global energy trends, regional nuances, and even glimpsed into the future with those seasonal forecasts.
It's been quite a ride.
It has, and I think the key takeaway here is that there's no silver bullet when it comes to energy. We need to embrace a multifaceted approach, diversification, regional collaboration, and a deep understanding of how climate variability impacts both our energy resources and our energy demands.
Couldn't agree more. It's about working with nature, not against it, and using all the tools at our disposal to create a more sustainable and energy-secure world.
Well said. And on that note of optimism and collaboration, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this fascinating and complex landscape.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we leave you with this thought as renewable energy becomes increasingly central to our world. How can we leverage climate information and predictive tools to ensure a stable and sustainable energy future? What role can individuals, communities, and governments play in this critical transition? Keep those brain gears turning, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.